Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the second public webinar organized by the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies at York University. I am so excited by your engagement and support of the work we're doing. We have a full registration, expect to have close to 1,000 people with us today. And I just am blown away really by the excitement and the understanding of the importance of the conversation we're going to be having today. I'm deeply appreciative of your presence and of the presence of our speakers. We have arranged to have live ASL interpretation and closed captioning for this session. All participants who would benefit from closed captioning are encouraged to bring their mouse to the bottom of the screen and select closed caption and then show subtitle. And I realize actually that a lot of people are still logging on. So I'm going to actually pause a little bit and just give people a chance to actually be present and then go over those instructions. So we have people joining quite rapidly. Okay, we're at 3:37 and still growing. Just going to wait another minute just to give people a chance to get in to the session and then give some housekeeping instructions. We're at 370, still growing. Still more people joining. Okay, it's 2:05, and so I'm going to continue. Thank you so much. Others continue to join. We are now over 400 participants. Thank you again so much for joining us this afternoon. We have arranged to have ASL interpretation and closed captioning for this session. Any participants who would benefit from closed captioning are encouraged to bring their mouse to the bottom of the screen and select closed caption and then show subtitle. If you're having trouble with this, please use the raise hand feature and you will be assisted privately in the Zoom chat. The event is also being live streamed on YouTube, and the YouTube link will now be provided in the chat. We encourage you to use the hashtag YUInFocus to share your reactions and comments. Thank you so much. Today, I have the honor and pleasure of being in conversation with three influential public intellectuals whose work has helped me and continues to help me think thoughtfully and deeply about issues that are critical to understanding our shared lived experiences on Turtle Island. Leanne Betasamosake Simpson, Robyn Maynard, and Shama Rangwala, thank you so much for accepting this invitation to be here in conversation with me about what it means to struggle together as co-resistors against anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism and other forms of white supremacy. I cannot tell you how grateful I am for your presence, for accepting my invitation, and for trusting me enough to be in conversation with me. I realize that Black and Indigenous scholars are extraordinarily overburdened by all of the requests that they're receiving in this time. And so I'm so glad and appreciative of your presence. My thanks to the Schulich School of Business and the Race Equity Caucus for co-sponsoring this event, to the event coordinator, Nazrin Vakilova, who has done an amazing job of preparing us for today, and the other members of the communications and IT teams, Anam Rahil, Sasha Smith, Catherine Skeen, Leanne Stetno, and George Ververidis. Our ASL interpreters, Christopher DeLugas and Joanne Martin from Toronto Sign Language Interpreter Service, and Marian Vianello, who's our live captioner. Thank you also for being here. I would like to acknowledge my own peculiar location in these territories. I recognize first that I am shadowed by the blurred but persistent history of Black communities that have existed in this place we call Canada for more than 200 years before my own arrival. I therefore walk in humble knowledge of all those who have gone before me. As a descendant of West Africans formerly enslaved in the Americas who were taken from their lands against their will, I acknowledge that I also live within the territories of many Indigenous peoples. I am committed to what Tiffany King calls a notion of mutual care, and I recognize that a future for Black peoples is not possible without a future for Indigenous peoples who have lived in these territories for many thousands of years and by whose leave I live, walk on, and share this land. It is my pleasure to welcome Vice President Equity, People and Culture, Professor Sheila Coate-Meek, who will read the university's land acknowledgement and bring greetings on behalf of her office. Professor Coate-Meek is Anishinaabe from the Teme Ogama Anishinaabe. A sociologist by training, she has a strong history of building relationships and working toward accessible higher education for all. Welcome, Sheila, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Greetings, bonjour, bonjour, kwekwe, samakwe dishnakas, makwadodem, temiagama Anishinaabe. Thank you, Professor Andrea Davis, for the welcome and also for the introduction. As well, many thanks to the organizers and sponsors of today's event. I think I'm a little blown away by the numbers that have joined us today. I think it's just a fabulous testament to not only the work, but the work that we're doing currently, but the work of the future. I would like to first start with a land acknowledgement. While I am Indigenous, the traditional lands of my community are located in Northeastern Ontario, and I'm also a visitor to where York University is located. As this meeting is virtual and we are not all gathered in the same space, I recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on. We ask that if this is the case, you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are located, as well as the current treaty holders. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have longstanding relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its own presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Personally, I'm very honored and very grateful to be here. I want to extend warm greetings from the Division of Equity, People and Culture at York University. This newly formed division has only been in existence for 1 year. It was established to support the growth of equity and build a positive organizational culture that brings together human resources, labor relations, and the Center for Human Rights, Equity, and Inclusion. Building on the work done by many faculties and community members, we are currently working on an anti-Black racism strategy, as well as a university equity strategy. Events such as these are important in reminding us about the importance of working together, as well as building and strengthening relationships and understandings across Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples. We all need to be working together in advancing the work that needs to be done around equity and inclusion, including addressing ongoing racism, whether it's overt or covert, which takes a huge personal and emotional toll on many of us. We need to support one another in this work. In my own family system teachings on reciprocity, reciprocity is centered around giving back and sharing with others and and in doing so, keeping a sense of balance in that never taking more than one needs, for example, from the land. I really look forward to hearing from the speakers about how different communities can engage in and live in reciprocity. Miigwech, merci, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheila. I'm also very pleased to welcome my colleague and friend, Professor Marcia Anisat, Associate Dean Academic, Schulich School of Business. Professor Anisat researches the social organization of the accountancy profession. Her research is historically and sociologically informed and examines how social exclusion based on religion, class, race, nationality, and immigration status interact with professional structures. Thank you so much, Marcia, for being here with us.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you for involving the Schulich School of Business in this event. I want to send greetings from the Schulich School of Business to Leanne, Robyn, and Shama, as well as all of you participants, organizers, and supporters of Living in Reciprocity. It is an honor and privilege to be associated with this very important conversation that has taken place today. The Schulich School of Business recognizes that anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism is not a problem for Black and Indigenous peoples, but it is a problem for all. And therefore, the struggle against this deadly affliction needs to be a struggle engaged in by all. So the conversations today about cross-community alliances are crucially important because they will provide the blueprint for incorporating all communities, all institutions, all agencies, until every sector, every fabric of our society is incorporated into the struggle. The Schulich community is fully engaged. Last Friday, I had the opportunity to attend the launch of the Schulich Black Students Association, an undergraduate club whose constitution includes phrases such as create solid linkages, foster partnerships, and promote allyships. So our students are engaged in the work of creating alliances. Every Monday for the past 7 weeks, a member of the Schulich faculty pairs up with a Black business practitioner to deliver a 2-hour seminar for its business certificate program. And this is a program delivered in partnership with ADBCC to Toronto's Black community for free. The program ends next week and plans are to repeat it. Finally, but not exhaustively, colleagues working with Indigenous leaders and communities are developing content for our curriculum. Content includes online modules covering topics such as Indigenous finance, Indigenous entrepreneurship. We've already had classroom engagements with Indigenous guest speakers on topics such as Indigenous leadership, economic reconciliation, Indigenous participation in wealth creation. And we are actively developing Indigenous business cases for in-class analysis. So in different ways, our professors are also engaged. The Schulich School of Business acknowledges that an enormous barrier has long existed between Black and Indigenous peoples and business schools. We will not rest until that barrier is completely dismantled. And we are confident that the learnings, commitments, and ways forward arrived at from the conversations today will bring us a step closer towards that goal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcia. Finally, Associate Dean Global and Community Engagement in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, Lily Chow, will deliver brief remarks on behalf of Dean J.J. McMurtry, who is unable to be with us today. Associate Dean Chow's research focuses on diasporic subjectivity within the fields of cultural studies, post-colonial literature and theory, and Asian, North American, and Canadian literatures. Lily, welcome.
Thank you, Andrea, for that very kind introduction. And thank you for all of your hard work. For those of you watching who may not be aware, Professor Davis has done a tremendous job in her first 2 months in the role of special advisor, taking the lead in several of our efforts to implement practices that directly respond to the anti-Black racism that exists in our society. And I mean, Andrea, I can't believe it's only been 2 months, so you've done so much. And I'm just thrilled to be here. Good afternoon to everyone who's here with us remotely. Thank you all for tuning in to today's special teach-in event. Though we'd all love the opportunity to hold this afternoon's conversation in person, it's really wonderful to see such an impressive virtual turnout. I'm thrilled to represent the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies as we continue to move forward with these integral public webinars. Earlier this year, our faculty made a strong commitment to address and combat anti-Black racism through a variety of tangible initiatives. Aspects of our plan range from the creation of postdoctoral fellowships, research funding, event supports, and student awards to other strategies such as program development and the hosting of public discussions like the one we're here for today. Today's teach-in will provide us all with an incredible opportunity to listen and learn how we can be better in our mission to counter anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and other forms of discrimination. Centered on the importance of and possibilities for cross-community alliance, today's dialogue promises to be educational, enlightening, and thought-provoking. As we strive to create more equitable and inclusive spaces, we all have a role to play. Allyship and solidarity are two essential components I hope we all bear in mind during this afternoon's webinar and as we proceed moving forward. Of course, acknowledging the ills of anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racism within the university setting, in addition to other areas of our country, is only the first step. So I encourage everyone in attendance to look within and search for ways to actively contribute to this unified front, my apologies, no matter how small or large your actions may seem. Lastly, on behalf of LANPS, I want to give a special shout out to today's guest speakers, Leanne Simpson, Robyn Maynard, Shama Rangwala, for taking the time to speak on this important subject. And on a personal note, it's a thrill to share this virtual room and be in this virtual room with scholars whose work I read and admire so much. Each of you bring indispensable knowledge and input to the topic of this afternoon's teach-in. And I look forward to engaging with the experiences you share, as well as the ideas you bring forth. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lily. We are going to now go into our conversation with our speakers. I'd like to introduce them to you first. They're going to open each with a 5-minute provocation in response to the title of today's event. And then we will have a more kind of free-flowing conversation and end the afternoon with about 30 minutes or so of questions that we will take from the audience. So I'm inviting participants to write their questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom, of your Zoom homepage, and we will collate those and try to get to as many of them as we can, although we realize that we might not be able to get through all of them. So let me introduce you to our speakers today. Shama Rangwala is a settler of Gujarati Muslim descent, living on Treaty 6 territory. She is my colleague in the Department of Humanities at York University and founding editor of Pyrescence. Her intermedia and interdisciplinary research focuses on the reproduction of racial capitalism in the modern history of settler colonialism and across narrative forms. Her academic writing has appeared in Public and English Studies in Canada, with a forthcoming article in Canadian Review of American Studies. A frequent contributor to news, podcasts, and other media, her public-facing writing has appeared in Jacobin, Public Books, The Star, The Globe and Mail, The Sprawl, and Canada Land. I'm going to introduce all the speakers together and before they offer their opening remarks. Robyn Maynard is our second speaker. She's the author of Policing Black Lives, State Violence in Canada from Slavery to the Present. The book is a national books bestseller, designated as one of the best 100 books of 2017 by the Hill Times, listed in the Walrus's Best Books of 2018, shortlisted for an Atlantic Book Award, the Concordia University First Book Prize, and the Mavis Gallant Prize for Nonfiction, and was the winner of the 2017 annual Errol Morris Book Prize. The book was published in French in 2018, and the French translation won the 2019 Prix de Libraire Award. Maynard has a long history of involvement in community activism. She recently helped create the website defundthepolice.org and is finalizing a national police defunding toolkit called Building the World We Want. She has been a part of grassroots movements against racial profiling, police violence, detention, and deportation for over a decade. She's currently a PhD student and Vanier Scholar at the University of Toronto and is also working on a book of letters with Leanne Simpson. And our third speaker, Leanne Betasamosake Simpson, is a Métis-Sahjic Nishnabeg academic scholar and musician. She's faculty at the Dashinta Center for Research and Learning and a member of Alderville First Nation. Widely recognized as one of the most compelling Indigenous voices of her generation, her work breaks open the intersections between politics, story, and song. She holds a PhD from the University of Manitoba and is the author of several books, including The Accident of Being Lost, published in 2017, which won the MacEwan University Book of the Year, was a finalist for the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize and the Trillium Book Award, was longlisted for CBC Canada Reads, and was named a Best Book of the Year by the Globe and Mail, the National Post, and Quill and Choir. Her new novel, Nupiming, The Cure for White Ladies, was published in September 2020. A warm thanks again to our three panelists. I'm going to now ask each of them to lead off with a 5-minute opening provocation in response to the event's title. They will each reflect on what living in reciprocity looks like or means to them, and why it's important that Indigenous, Black, and other racialized peoples stand together in the struggle against white supremacy. I'm going to ask Shama to start this conversation, and then Robyn will go second, and then Leanne will close in response. Shama?
Thank you so much, Andrea, for inviting me. The speaker series has been really amazing, and thank you so much for all the work you do. Thanks also to Robyn and Leanne. I've learned so much from both of you and your work, so I'm really humbled to be here with you. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I'm located in Amiskwichi, Waskahigan on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others. I would also like to acknowledge the ways that I have benefited from the colonization of this land, how multiculturalism allowed for the immigration of people like my parents to Turtle Island, and how this multiculturalism is anti-Black and anti-Indigenous. We are here today to talk about Black, Indigenous, and Brown solidarity, and I'd like to start by interrogating that term Brown and the way it signifies differently depending on space and time. When I was younger, I used to use the term Brown to distance myself from Indianness and Muslimness. Being Indian was being Apu, being Muslim was being a terrorist, but being Brown was cosmopolitan. Since Black and white are colors, and I could just be another color in the rainbow too. We see this in Obama calling himself and his sister the brown children of his mother. It was a way to make myself legible in particular ways while obscuring others. The terms of this talk are Black, Indigenous, and Brown, but Brown is not the same kind of category as Black and Indigenous. It is not a racial formation in the way that, say, Michael Omi and Howard went on theorize. And that's not just because there are cleavages within brownness, because of course, Indigenous and Black people are heterogeneous too. The categories of Indigenous and Blackness, and white for that matter, are foundational to settler colonialism here and global imperialism in a way that the category of Brown is not. On the flip side, to the obfuscatory function of the term brown, there is also a use of brown, like the term people of color, that can be capacious and open up solidarities between differently colonized people. So how do we begin to talk about relationality between categories that are not commensurate? I think it's important to talk about the cleavages within Brown because they have different relationships to white supremacy and thus serve particular functions in reinforcing and reproducing anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racisms. Depending on what kind of brown you are, which of course varies by religion, ethnicity, caste, geography, and colonialisms, you have different relationships to white supremacy. Brown is not Muslim or Gujarati or the more geographical South Asian or the more communal Desi, which comes from the word for home and abstraction. Instead, Brown emerges as part of the flattened multiculturalism or cosmopolitanism that provides ideological cover for anti-Blackness and anti-Indigeneity in the post-civil rights era. As Vijay Prashad writes of the contemporary position of Brown people in Karma of Brown folk, we are not simply a solution for Black America, but most pointedly, a weapon deployed against it. It does not have to be this way. And ultimately, the only thing that benefits from this is whiteness, which must be dismantled. Plunder, enslavement, and genocide in South and West Asia, the African continent, and the so-called Americas, these forms of imperial and settler colonialisms are entwined. This is why relationality and solidarity between our peoples is so threatening, and colonizers know this. For example, in the 19th century, the West Indian Commission had to specifically manufacture policies to keep African and Indian people apart. Our separation was and is necessary to empire, and our togetherness is necessary to dismantling it. The desire for connection is strong. However, it often ends up reproducing the same anti-Black and anti-Indigenous structures of power, or the same flattening of multiculturalism and erasure of history. Brownness wasn't represented, so brown kids in North America grow up identifying with Black people on TV, or create new forms like fusing Bhangra and hip hop. At the same time, anti-Blackness is pervasive in these communities. I'm also thinking of Isabel Wilkerson's recent book that relates anti-Black racism to caste hierarchies. The book is saturated with the affect of belonging across difference, but the production and operations of caste is very different from that of Blackness, and ultimately obscures the clear foundations we need to build upon. Though perhaps misguided, I think we should take from these examples that the desire and pull for relationality as colonized people is powerful and pervasive. After all, despite the ways that white supremacy tries to fragment and diffuse its power, there's also a long history of internationalism, from Fanon to Said to the Combahee River Collective, the Black Panthers and Dalit Panthers, Muslims, especially Palestinians, and Indigenous movements such as Standing Rock, and of course the global BLM protests. I'm looking forward to talking today with Robyn and Leanne about how to harness these real desires for relationships across differences in a way that maintains specificities and builds solidarities for the liberation of all colonized people. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Shama. Robyn, may I ask you to share your thoughts?
Absolutely. And first of all, I just want to say thank you so much, particularly to you, Andrea Davis, for organizing this event and for everything that you've done in the service of Black students at the York community. It's something that is seen and deeply appreciated well beyond this webinar, so thank you. And I'm very glad to be joining Shama and Leanne. Thank you as well to our ASL interpreters. So I'm going to start with answering the second part of the question, which is the why, before moving into the first. And I have 5 suggestions or provocations from the place from which I suggest we can start to begin to think about what it means to live in reciprocity. So the why, I think, we're perhaps more acutely aware of the collective crises that we're facing in our present, in our future, in a time where the land and air and water is poisoned at a tipping point. We're living in a series of intersecting and overlapping catastrophes, of course, that have been foretold by decades and more of climate science, of Indigenous and Black community knowledge, undergirding, of course, the hashtag that I love to see every time it emerges, hashtag Octavia told us, referencing Octavia Butler in the Parable series. There are multiple registers of the crisis at hand, and I think if we look at the climate crisis, the pandemic, and the ongoing crisis of the incarceration and murder of Black and Indigenous peoples at the hands of the police and at the state, we see that our respective communities, Black and Indigenous communities especially, are collectively positioned at the forefront of the unfolding catastrophes. And of course, when I speak about climate in particularly, I'm speaking about the globally calamitous outcomes for Black and Indigenous peoples, for all formerly colonized people, especially with Cyclone Ida in Malawi, Mozambique and Zimbabwe, with Hurricane Dorian in Bahamas, the forest fires displacing Indigenous communities in the Amazon rainforest. We see, of course, the studies that are now emerging demonstrating what we already knew, which is the grossly disproportionate vulnerability to death that particularly Indigenous communities on reserves, that Black communities, Black peoples deemed essential, are disposable workers are facing in the context of COVID-19. And of course, with the killing of Aisha Hudson, Breonna Taylor, Regis Kaczynski-Paquet, we see, the Winnipeg Free Press actually found in July that we are already facing double the annual average of people being killed by police, which was already, of course, intolerable. I say this as a way of setting the context for the grossly disproportionate way that we are being exposed to death on a global scale that has ramped up to proportions that feel apocalyptic. And the apocalypse is, of course, imagined in the Western and European terms as the destruction of places where we live, poisoned earth and land, inhumane and increasingly restrictive responses to people who've been left hungry and displaced. And we need to remember that for our communities, particularly for Black and Indigenous communities, we have borne already multiple apocalypses, inflicted, if unidentically, since what Hilary Beckles, Caribbean historian, borrowing the words of Barbadian communities, describes as barbarity times of genocide, of slavery across the Americas. So to remix Public Enemy, apocalypse been in effect for Black people since the apocalypse of the transatlantic slave trade, which Emnor BC, I think Philip, captures this really beautifully by describing, in her words, the twin genocides at the founding of the Americas as nothing short of apocalyptic moments. And of course, the racially uneven distribution of vulnerability and harm of these crises is far from accidental, but comes from the racial colonial logics that are built into an enduring scaffolding of a global order that's premised on racial and ecological violence. I think that it's helpful for us to reframe, of course, the causes of this away from something that is caused by humanity. And in doing so, of course, I'm referencing brilliant work that has been done before, including Françoise Vergès and the framing of the racial Capitolocene of Catherine Yusof and the Black Anthropocenes, Badur Alagra's work that is coming, that asks us to challenge, of course, the human at the heart of who is being seen as the cause of the multiple crises of our time, that reframes slavery, genocide, industrial capitalism as causal to the multiple crises that we're facing, to say that these crises have shared roots, that rightly position the crises in different terms as one of racial capitalism, that racial capitalism is the pandemic, is the virus, is the climate crisis. So to put it slightly differently, the crises are not only being born unevenly, but in a manner that's purposefully uneven, that's uneven by design. In Dion Brand's words, A Calculus of Living and Dying, which is local and profoundly global, in which access to life and death are distributed along the lines of race, gender, sexuality, class, and geography, among many others. So given all of these conditions, I wanted to propose 5 places from which we can start to think about reciprocity that are interrelated to me. The first is that we begin from the formulation in the thinking alongside Ruth Wilson Gilmore that life is precious, that all life is precious, that facing these crises that are threatening all life and some lives more than others, that only a deep respect for life, all of it provides us the capacity to reimagine life organized and governed other than this, relationships to one another other than this, that we are responsible to one another. The second place from which I think we can depart, that I'm trying to depart from, is that all world endings are not tragic. This is not, to be clear, a survival of the fittest, eco-fascist or Malthusian acceptance of the climate crisis and the pandemic, of the global carceral state. I don't want us to accept the terrifying predictions forwarded by the IPCC, but I do think we need to recognize that there's no tragedy in the ending of this particular incarnation of the world, the way that it's governed. I'm proposing that there is no tragedy in the end of the world that white supremacy, slavery, colonialism, and racial capitalism built. And it's from this understanding, a refusal to be nostalgic for any return to a status quo that was murderous, that is as liberating as it is perhaps frightening, that we can begin to formulate what is asked and needed of us to survive the present and the future, to build livable worlds together in the protection of the viability of this planet that nourishes us. Another starting place I think that we can begin from is starting from the place that we have our own ontologies, outside of the murderous episteme of the present, of the settler, of the master. In this episteme that we're currently working to break with, all life is valued only for its exploitability, its fungibility, its use value. There's no preciousness to life, to keep thinking with Gilmore. But many of us are survivors and ancestors of the long enduring apocalypse in which all has not been lost. And we need to remember that Cedric Robinson describes this as the ontological totality that we have held up against, in the words of Robin Kelley, against the terror of capitalism, that Black people's traditions of radicalism, of which we're still beholden to and building from and experimentally departing from, there are alternative ways of relating to lands, to one another, to family and gender, the organization of life that's not tethered to hierarchy, to extraction, but to their opposite. In Leanne Simpson's As We Have Always Done and Nick Estes' Our History is the Future, we see again the longstanding surviving epistemologies of those who survived the apocalypse and carried forward visions of kinship, of relationships to land into the future. I would even suggest that we're actually collectively uniquely situated to imagine a future, multiple futures that are not yet born, of life lived in reciprocity because of this. The fourth suggestion that I have is relationships of temporality go beyond linear progress narratives and relationships to the past, present, future, are those that allow us to move forward differently. If we view the present as part of an enduring apocalypse, we are able to break up with the civilizational logics of Western society's inevitable march toward progress and this particular teleology, to understand that ecocide and genocide are at the heart of the Western civilization project also allows us to reject this temporal framing, and then allows us to move away from the idea that there's anything natural or inevitable about the present. This allows us to move toward a rupture with the status quo. And finally, if we understand the fifth provocation I wanted to leave us with, if we understand that we're always already building the worlds we want, the worlds we need to survive, if we look to what is happening behind bars, the ongoing hunger strike to free all people being held captive in a pandemic, and more broadly, that the people in encampments refusing to leave, demanding housing for all, and those working to support them. Black Lives Matter, Not Another Black Life, the Indigenous free lands, free people working to end our society's reliance on policing, prison, and to build alternatives, that life is being built in reciprocity always already. So the last thing I wanted to say is that we're engaged in the struggle of a lifetime, but we can see living in reciprocity as an ethical demand that tells us that we are responsible to one another, that the struggle for Black lives, for Indigenous lives, for all people subject to colonial, neo-colonial rule, state abandonment and captivity, and for life on this planet, and that only by changing our relationship to life itself, to living, by committing to life and life lived reciprocally, that we can begin to rebuild this world anew. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robyn. Leanne, please go ahead.
Ani Kinewaya, Gilgabiju Nidenuema, Kinagachi Anishinaabe Goguming Nidonjaba, Nagojawani Megwadoda, Betasamosake Nadijnakas, Nagichinandam Gibijayan, Gibim Bachanguk. Hi, friends. I am Machisagi Kinishinaabeg or Ojibwe, and our territory is on the north shore of Lake Ontario. We are located in the eastern part of Anishinaabe territory, and so we have close ties to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, with whom we share Lake Ontario. My particular understanding of life comes from this particular part of the world. It comes from this Machisagi Kinishinaabeg practice of life, living in deep relationality with the lands, the waters, the plants, the animals, and the peoples of Kinagachi Anishinaabe Oguming, the place where we all live and work together. It comes from Nayano, Nibimong, Gitchigaming, the Great Lakes. It comes from maple sugar bushes, carrying and filtering water from the soil, combining it with light and converting it to sweet sugar. It comes from lake shores full of monomen or wild rice, gathering strength in mid-July and moving from floating to standing. It comes from black bears that wake up in Makwagizis in February, turn in their dens on bed of blueberry branches, and then settle back into fasting and dreaming for a few more weeks. This land has taught me that Anishinaabe life is a continual, reciprocal, reflective, and often critical interaction with my ancestors, those yet to be born, and the nations of plants and animals I share land with. It is a living constellation of co-resistance with all of the anti-colonial peoples of the earth and the worlds they build. Anishinaabe life is a persistent world-building process in spite of and despite the constant imposition of dispossession and the colonial machinery of elimination. I am ever so grateful to be here today with Robyn, Shama, and Andrea, because this idea of living in reciprocity with Black and Brown peoples is something that is extremely important to me. My last academic work, as we have always done, Indigenous Freedom Through Radical Resistance, came out in the same year as Robyn's book, Policing Black Lives, State Violence in Canada from Slavery to the Present. I remember wishing that Robyn's book had come out first because it would have made As We Have Always Done better. Much better in my mind. I would have brought Policing Black Lives into conversation with the chapters in As We Have Always Done. And so when an opportunity presented itself to launch my book in Montreal, I wanted to seize that opportunity to be in conversation with Robyn and her book. To be honest, this is pretty gutsy of me, given that I'm shy and introverted, and Robyn and I had never met, but the stars aligned and our conversation took place on April 14th, 2018, and was moderated by curator, art historian, author, and academic Lindsay Nixon. This was Robyn and my very first conversation. I remember the Black community of Montreal showing up in power to the event. I remember being very nervous, as one should be when their first conversation with someone is on a stage with a mic in front of a beautiful, articulate, and intelligent audience. I remember Robyn's pink lipstick and my Blistex. I remember being dressed like I was from Ontario, not Montreal. I can't remember very much about what we talked about, but we obviously had the sense to record it because there's an edited transcript of part of our conversation in Until We Are Free, Reflections on Black Lives Matter in Canada. In 2019, as part of my work at the Chinta Center for Research and Learning in Denendeh, or what is known as the Northwest Territories, I helped conceptualize, organize, and actualize a solidarity gathering that took place in March with my colleague Glenn Coulthard in his territory, the territory of the Yellowknives Dene First Nation. Our idea was simple: to invite a small group of Black, Brown, and Indigenous activists, thinkers, writers, and organizers to spend time with us in the spring. Now, spring in the Northwest Territories is very much what we call winter in Ontario. But we invited this group to spend time with us in the spring on an island in what the Dene know as Tinde, or Big Lake. Together, we fished nets under the ice. We traveled by snowmobile and sleigh across the frozen lake. We shared moose ribs and cooked over the fire. We listened to stories from the elders, and we shared our own ideas and time with each other. We wanted to invest in our relationship with each other and our affinities outside of the institution, the internet, and crisis, because we believed that the land would pull out a different set of conversations and gift us with a different way of relating. We wanted to sit on the land, immersed in a Dene world, engaged in a radical practice of Dene hospitality to see if we could relate to each other in a new way. This is exactly what happened. the land nurtured a different set of conversations and way of relating to each other outside of institution and its formations. I remember Robyn and I eating muskox around the fire, talking about how different eating muskox around a fire in the bush was from meeting in the hallway or a bar at a conference or interacting online. We were also meeting, and there was no crisis or blockade or occupation or protest. We were coming together to nourish each other, to relate to each other, to listen, to share, and to breathe together, to use Narbesi Phillips' thinking. I could intellectualize about the experience and speak in terms of relationality and relationship building, something I think that Black and Indigenous activists in the 1960s and 1970s understood far better than us. I could talk about this from an Indigenous methodological angle, with visiting and developing relationships of trust as foundational to any exchange of knowledge and experience. I could write about the spiritual dimension of this work from, again, Anishinaabe perspectives, being surrounded by trees, medicine, air, sky, and water. In a sense, though, none of that particularly matters, other than to say, I think that land-based politics, grounded in a sustained and nurturing relationship with the national world, means protecting nature as a means of protecting us. It's a generated means of nourishing Black and Indigenous politics of solidarity. Our starting point was simple, that land and placemaking was important to both Black and Indigenous peoples. Our starting point was a refusal of the nation state and racial capitalism, white supremacy, and heteropatriarchy embodied in that scaffolding. Our starting point was a recognition that transatlantic slavery and its afterlives and settler colonialism means we have distinctive and intertwined histories, presence, and distinctive and intertwined theory, resistances, and world-building practices. We imagined the synergistic potential of Black land politics added to Indigenous land politics towards liberated lands and bodies. In the aftermath of that gathering, the possibilities to continue this work seemed endless. Trips to the sugar bush, hikes in downtown Toronto, exchanges of our freedom schools, gatherings in the Caribbean, and then the pandemic hit. We were faced with another crisis on top of the crisis of anti-Blackness, colonialism, and climate change. Our lives shrunk into our home spaces in lockdown. There was an urgency in addressing the pandemic under white supremacy because we knew that Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples are always the first to die, and that state solutions would be bolstered to whiteness. Zoom seemed like the very last place we wanted to continue this work. In fact, to me, it felt like virtual environments were antithetical to this work. And so Robyn and I decided to write each other letters because we couldn't see each other in person. And because this is an honored Black feminist methodology of scaffolding the intimate and the personal within the international and the global. We decided to not only write what we know, but attempt to think through things together, to think alongside, to generate through this intentional relationship a sort of study of Black and Indigenous relationality through the study of our own relationality. We made a commitment to each other to think things through together, through the chaos of a global pandemic, through the ongoing pandemic of Black and Indigenous death and erasure, and through the beautiful revolutions of Black and Indigenous organizing and resistances. We agreed to be first and foremost accountable to each other, which required a new level of trust and vulnerability that for me was new in my intellectual work. This project sustained me through the past few months. What began as a series of letters with footnotes between two dorky, kind of awkward writers has grown into something that has expanded outside the two of us. We've been working on editing these letters to share them in a new book. This comes from thinking about Black and Indigenous audiences first. as both a commitment to sharing knowledge our peoples do not get from state-run institutions, and a commitment to the kind of radical thought that is crucial to our survival and our resistance movements and mobilizations. Black and Indigenous people have different and linked experiences with transatlantic slavery, its anti-Black afterlives, and settler colonialisms. We have different and linked histories and radical practices of resistance. We have different and linked current world building projects of abolition and anti-colonialism. Black and Indigenous peoples have different and linked experiences with land-based politics, placemaking, and expansive and recursive dispossession of land and bodies. I see this distinctiveness and diversity as power. Our different and linked struggles for freedom as a place, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore reminds us, involve lands and bodies. We have been living in successive waves of pandemics of anti-Blackness and colonialism in the ever-intensifying crisis of global warming. And as Gilmore says in speaking about abolition, we must change everything. Abolition is deliberately an everythingist. It's about the entirety of human environmental relations. Where life is precious, life is precious. It's a theory of change. Where life is precious, not just human life, but all life. Black and Indigenous world building projects are a complete overturning of life in North America and beyond, radical imaginings that take place outside of the nation state and racial capitalism. These are necessary international projects, and so our reciprocity and radical hospitality must extend to places like Palestine and other racialized peoples and anti-colonial fronts. Maybe then land and our relationship to it can become a listening, a thinking, a speaking in a different register, a different starting point for Black and Indigenous relationality. Maybe Black and Indigenous land-based politics hold potential for our world building and freedom struggles, or as Zoe Samudzi and William Anderson write in Black as Resistance, the actualization of truly liberated land can only come about through dialogue and co-conspiratorial work with Native communities and a shared understanding of land use outside of capitalistic models of ownership. I care about Indigenous and Black solidarity because Anishinaabe thought and the Indigenous radical political practice I have inherited cares about Black people. The ethics that eschew and actively resist genocide, destruction of the lands and waters, and the violence of life under conquest. It is an Indigenous political practice that proceeds and moves towards Black and Indigenous world makings, the generation of Black and Indigenous life, the continual making and remaking of home, and the co-mingling of our collective home spaces, our unique systems of meaning, politics, ethics, and life way. I care because I believe, perhaps naively, that Black land-based politics and Indigenous land-based politics coming together hold potentiality for modes of relating outside racial capitalism, heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, for Black and Indigenous freedom struggles, and for world-making practices. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Leanne. I'm going to ask Shama and Robyn to turn their cameras on and join us. Thank you so much for those incredibly thought-provoking responses. We're going to move into a little bit of a free-flowing conversation. We are 4 women sitting and talking together. So I'd like to start there, to think a little bit about what it means to live through, walk through the world as Indigenous Black and otherwise racialized women. How do the forces of white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, but also capitalism function to both oppress Black, Brown, and Indigenous women, as well as potentially constrain the possibilities for solidarity across our differences? And anyone can go first. Thank you. Shama?
I can go. So this is something I think about a lot in my teaching with how to teach about gender. So white supremacy and capitalism are patriarchal, and gender is also a colonial formation. And this is not just in the sense that cis heteronormativity was imposed on our people. Of course, many of our ancestral societies had multiple genders before colonization, but also that the category of woman itself is produced differently in colonized places. White women reproduce the white nation and are protected as such and support white supremacy as such. So I think about how the reproduction of the white nation regulates women's sexuality differently depending on race. And so we have, the white heteropatriarchal backlash to white women's gains, resulting in abortion bans, which of course will affect racialized women and poor women of all races more. And at the same time as these abortion bans were coming out, we were also seeing brown babies in cages at the border, Black and Indigenous kids without safe drinking water, suicide epidemics on reserves, and of course the ongoing genocide against Indigenous people, manifesting in the missing and murdered Indigenous women epidemic. So we actually have to start with disaggregating this category of women as a way to build solidarities, because otherwise these very fundamental differences will be flattened under liberal feminism. Women do unwaged or underwage labor globally and have different social relations to the state, and this is also racialized. Liberal feminism is structurally white, and the gains that are made in liberal feminist movements are on the backs of brown women who clean their houses and take care of their children. And here I'm using the most capacious version of brown. Women are pitted against each other, for example, as Muslim women being weaponized for imperialist feminism. So instead, we are seeing this growth of an anti-capitalist and internationalist feminism, and it actually has a long history, famously articulated by the Combahee River Collective in the 70s, and more recently, the Feminism for the 99% Manifesto. And since today is Trans Day of Remembrance, I also want to bring up how hegemonic feminism has adapted to allow some women of color into their ranks by becoming deeply transphobic. So the idea is that the bounded category of woman used to be white. Now it's not, because of liberal colorblindness and multiculturalism. So it has to be bounded in some other way. And that way today is taking the form of cis supremacy. So we can't talk about TERFs without talking about whiteness. Even as there are, of course, some individual TERFs who are not white, the category of TERF is structurally white. So Solidarities as colonized people absolutely has to include dismantling cis heteronormativity, and Andrea mentions capitalism as well.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Shama. I'm happy to speak next. Excuse me, the sunshine has just decided to come through the window at this hilariously blinding angle, but I'll speak even though I can hardly see you all at this moment. I think that, Shama, you pointed out something really important about the ways in which that transphobia is working so much in concert with white supremacy in manners that are so violently hard, like really moving forward so many of the violent hierarchies of race and gender to the continual exclusion, the continual hierarchying of who is or is not human, who is or is not woman, who is or is not valued, right? So I think that you're getting to something really crucial in that, coming up against a certain kind of hierarchical sorting that's really at the heart of the kind of civilization that we live in is absolutely crucial in terms of our anti-colonial solidarities, in terms of Black, Indigenous, and racialized solidarities more broadly, right? That I think there's something that's so essential about understanding the different kind of hierarchical logics and sorting patterns that we need to overcome if we're going to be able to effectively mount a project in the service of liberation. And I've been thinking about this a little bit too, in terms of just the ways that colonial structures do set us really against each other. And there was this sort of what became a Twitter famous Toronto Star editorial board article that came out on June 12th at the height of the Black-led rebellions across North America. And the title of this was, "Let's Save Some Outrage for the Treatment of Indigenous People." So in this, you can see a kind of framing and a kind of creation of weaponizing peoples against one another that of course was not existing on the ground. As if outrage is finite, as if it needs to be allotted across particular compartments lest it be wasted on only one kind of injustice, right? As if, and again, it really goes just against what was happening, the realities on the ground in which we saw so much support, particularly in Black and Indigenous communities, led broadly by Black women, like transgender, non-conforming people, and Indigenous women and Two-Spirit peoples as well, to push to defund the police, to defund the RCMP. When we actually saw a broad collaboration at this time, we have this sort of weaponization, this intentional attempt to sort of separate our communities against one another. And I was thinking about that so much in this way that I realized, in a sense, it's correct. If we're appealing to the colonial state, if we're appealing to the status quo, there is a limited amount of outrage, right, that can be distributed in the vast injustices of our time. Within the logics of white supremacy, of racial capitalism, we're required to tolerate a certain level of violence and death as part of business as usual. So people dying of drug overdoses on the streets of our cities, the egregious and ongoing harms that our communities continue to experience, it necessarily is kept out of sight most of the time, because this kind of discomfort, this kind of outrage, if sustained, would lead, of course, to the broader demand for the always possible, but always disavowed transformations that would actually be required of our society if we wanted to end this kind of racialized and gendered violence. So this speaks really to the limitations of what it means when we're working in a certain kind of appeal, in a certain kind of appeal to whiteness, and a certain kind of appeal to the state. Because of course there's no limit to the outrage that we feel in our day-to-day lives. I have more than enough rage in my heart and in my life to sustain me for Colton Bushi, for Aicha Hudson, for Chantal Moore, for Ijaz Chowdhury, for Regis Kaczynski-Paquet. And in moments of rebellion and moments of revolt, we see that the rage of people who have been historically dispossessed is something that creates enormous fear across our society, right? So I think that the ways but let's see. There's no limit to, of course, the outrage of whiteness, of course, when it comes to be threatened, right? The bare and open and violent rage in the service of protection of whiteness. I pulled out this Audre Lorde quote because I think it's so helpful in this sense. She says, "For it's not the anger of Black women which is dripping down over this globe like a diseased liquid. It's not my anger that launches rockets, spends over $60,000 a second on missiles and other agents of war and death, slaughters children in cities, stockpiles nerve gas and chemical bombs, sodomizes our daughters and our earth. It's not the anger of Black women which corrodes into blind dehumanizing power, bent upon the annihilation of us all unless we meet it with what we have." And she goes on, but I think there's another kind of rage when we're not gearing it towards the outrage of the status quo, of the rulers of our society, the kind of rage that is generative, that we're seeing happen all the time, right? The kind of rage that we're seeing in our communities that is not based on a scarcity logic, and often just results in sort of one Black woman getting an award, one person getting a job as a diversity officer. The kind of rage that's grounding our movements is generative. It's the call to defund, dismantle, abolish policing, prisons, cease the RCMP. These come from a kind of rage that's geared toward the construction of alternatives, right? So I think that there's one way in which we're asked to skew, just really to sum up this ask for outrage for us. And if we actually instead turn towards the generative power of anger, of rage instead, as something that's mutual, as something that's world building, then we really get ourselves into a very different place of creating the kinds of worlds that would sustain life instead of continually destroy it.
I think the short answer is that the impact of all of this is death and elimination on Black bodies and on Indigenous bodies. And I think for the past 2 decades, Indigenous women and queer people in the Indigenous community have been organizing against the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, queer, and trans people. And I've always felt frustrated by the way this crisis gets diagnosed and discussed by the state. And that frustration has spilled into how I think that I interact with the mobilization around missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, Two-Spirit, queer, and trans peoples. And so one of the things I did with my frustration was I started to look to Black feminists, to abolition thinkers, to the Black radical tradition, to look at how they were conceptualizing the elimination of Black life. So the book Invisible No More by Andrea Ritchie was really important for me to come to this understanding that from an abolition perspective, the focus on organizing was shifted away from individual harm to systemic change. It was shifted away from let's reform how the police are investigating our murders and our missing peoples, and eliminate, create worlds, build movements on the ground to defund and to eliminate the need for policing, which is broader for Indigenous peoples than just the police, but to eliminate police and policing from our societies. And so that became a really important shift for me in my own thinking. That combined with sort of Anishinaabe thinking around rejecting this colonial gender binary that sets up the hierarchy in our communities and our formations and allows things like heteropatriarchy and white supremacy and racial capitalism to infiltrate us, becomes a different way, I think, of conceptualizing the problem and organizing against the problem.
Thank you so much. I guess tied to the question of gender is also, well, you know, the way that capitalism functions, and you know, the ways in which multiple forms of oppression meet, you know, so capitalism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, they all really come out of the same kind of root. We are sitting, well, not sitting, but we are having a conversation that's facilitated through various departments in a university. So the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, 2 humanities scholars from that faculty, but also with support from the business school, the Race Equity Caucus. And I think it's probably important that we think about and acknowledge the university's role in supporting and advancing anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racisms. And I just wondered if any of you wanted to comment on that. We all of us have different relationships to the academy in one way or another.
I can go. So I'm going to make some general statements about Canadian universities. I know York U is a bit different and has a different reputation for, you know, having a student population that's majority non-white, and I've been here for less than 6 months, so I can't really talk about York U very much specifically. But one of the obvious ways that the university is structurally racist is by reproducing inequality with the illusion of meritocracy. And of course, class is inextricable from race. So I think that every university needs to rethink disciplinary grading and assignments that reproduce those race and class inequalities. And the academy is deeply colonial on every level, from the policies that come out of it to justify imperialism and capitalism to its very space. So there's a fairly recent monument on U of A campus of 2 white men looking at a map, they're founders of the university, surveying the land for building the university. And I always call them the settler bros. It's an incredible monument to install new at the same time the university is you know, making noises about you know, so-called reconciliation. And of course, my alma mater still has a statue of you know, notorious enslaver James McGill on its campus. In terms of so-called diversity, a lot of the racial representation in the academy tends to be non-Black and non-Indigenous people of color, and often international students who are a revenue source for the university. So these non-Black, non-Indigenous people of color can fulfill quotas and makes the university look diverse, even as it reproduces anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. Black students are often international students, which reinforces the idea of Blackness as elsewhere. This might be different at York, and it's also why I think Andrea's Black Canadian Studies certificate is so important. International students can be pitted against racialized students who are, quote unquote, from here. And another thing I've observed is that there are two kinds of racialized students, especially in grad studies. And the first kind is held up as exemplary because they can perform whiteness and went to colonial schools that gave them a facility in the canon, et cetera. And these students are supported and celebrated. But then there are also students who don't have that kind of social and cultural capital, and they're not put forth for scholarships. Faculty are not there to supervise their projects. And because they don't have that funding, they're often working multiple jobs and overburdened. But because that first category exists, the data can say, hey, we have these racialized students, so look how diverse we are, when actually they're reproducing the same epistemologies and inequalities.
Do Robyn and Leanne want to add anything to that question?
I will just add a really quick point, which I think, outside of my own agnostic and back and forth relationships with the university and academy more broadly, I think we also need to recognize just the very structural role that universities have in gentrifying neighborhoods that are often neighborhoods with high Black populations, and the policing that accompanies that, right? That often even places where people might be having grants to study policing and urban displacement are often, at the same time, not being accountable to the very embeddedness of the university with those practices. The disciplining of academics in support of Palestine, for example, is something that's also very much a part of how some universities are continuing to function at this time that continues to be displaced, I guess. So I guess I just really wanted to draw our attention to the real the lived experience of the university as kind of a place that it can itself, as well as, the existence of police on campuses, right? Or security on campuses and the racial profiling that can happen there. That it's not only, the very real erasure of Black experiences, the lack of hiring of Black professors is something that also, of course, profoundly shapes what's considered knowledge in this country. I had not had a Black professor until my PhD. For example, right? So that's something that's very much its own kind of violence, but also I just wanted to bring that attention back to the real structural embeddedness as well in the complicities that are a part of universities.
Well, I think the university system is designed to reproduce racial capitalism, heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, and colonialism. And so I think if we're to engage in radical imaginings outside of those systems, we have to imagine a different system of education. We have to imagine a different way. We have to dismantle the university. And while I think there are so many Black, Brown, and Indigenous students doing this work on campuses, there is also a few professors that are doing this work. I think that for me, I want to build something outside of that system, something completely different, something that's free, something that teaches the kind of skills that we need to build worlds and to live in those worlds in a way where we're not reproducing the things that we don't want to reproduce.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, the university certainly is not exempt from conversations about white supremacy, and in fact is deeply, deeply, deeply implicated in those conversations. I wonder if you might also help our participants think about how we might build different worlds, how we might reorient the way we think into ways that are more generative, not of death, but of life and possibility and healing and the very thing we're talking about, which is reciprocity. I think, for example, about the way in which the Canadian settler colonial state and its discourse of multicultural citizenship entrenches and obfuscates anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. And could you help us think about how an Indigenous understanding of nation and land could help us articulate a different kind of relationship to place and to each other?
It seems like we're going in this order, but if either of you want to go.
I think Leanne
yeah?
was
Okay,
going to.
yeah, go ahead.
Leanne?
I just heard Indigenous and I thought that I need to unmute myself. Well, I think we have to first reject colonialism and reject the ways that colonialism insists that we interact with each other and insists how we talk about those things. So colonialism for Indigenous peoples has meant an expansive dispossession, the removal of Indigenous bodies from the land we're attached to, the removal of Indigenous peoples from our languages, our political systems, our culture, our sense of self, and the intelligence systems that give us meaning. It's also meant a usurpation of Indigenous political power. And all of this is done and maintained to implement this system of racial capitalism where resources can be easily removed from our territories, to facilitate white settlement, and to employ legal and political processes that are designed and necessary to dominate and control Indigenous peoples. Kind of all of this is done with violence, with the threat of violence, and with symbolic violence in order to maintain that system. And so Robert Nichols writes about how this dispossession is also recursive, in that the state not only takes land from Indigenous people, but also then converts it to property, and also brings in a language of property and ownership, and then the nation state. And so using this scaffolding of colonialism, using this expansive and recursive scaffolding of dispossession, the state presents a series of options to us. Reconciliation, we'll talk very narrowly about individual harm in residential schools, but we're not going to talk about the 400 years of occupation that these schools were a part of. And we're certainly not going to talk about land or Canada's role in the transatlantic slave trade and anti-Blackness, off the table. We're going to talk about the phenomenon of missing and murdered Indigenous women. You're going to have to advocate to include girls. You're going to have to advocate to include queer people. And we are certainly not going to talk about land. And we are certainly not going to talk about missing and murdered Black people or abolition. If you want to talk about getting land back, get used to the idea of property, get used to the idea of ownership, get used to the idea of enclosure, because you can either negotiate with the state through the comprehensive or specific land claims, or you can go to court. If you want to talk about getting political power back or becoming a municipality, then you can enter into self-government negotiations. So all of these sorts of structures that Indigenous people are forced to participate in aren't Indigenous structures at all. And they end up having they end up imposing and fragmenting and putting up barriers to good relations with Black people, with brown people, with other racialized people and anti-colonial movements. And so I think that we have to find a different way outside of the nation state, outside of capitalism, outside of enclosure and ownership, to come together and to start to talk about these ideas, because it isn't just Indigenous peoples who have ideas of how to make and build and live in formations that are outside of racial capitalism or the nation state. There's volumes of books that Black academics and activists and intellectuals have written about how to do that. And so it's not a matter of me talking about how Anishinaabe people might relate to each other through the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. This has to be a sharing, a radical hospitality of making different home spaces together and figuring out how to relate to those. It can't just be my ideas.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. I know that Shama was going to respond as well, but I am cognizant of the fact that it's 3:24. We want to finish at 4 o'clock, and there are about 10 questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to ask the speakers, the panelists, just to respond to one final kind of wrap-up question, and then I'll go into the Q&A. I won't be able to ask all of the questions, but I'll do my best. Some of them hopefully have been answered during some of the conversation. So the closing kind of wrap-up question for each of our panelists. We're living in a really scary world, what Robyn describes as a world made up of intersecting catastrophes. Growing climate emergency, deepened poverty, and food precarity for racialized people across the globe, a health crisis, calls for racial justice. It's difficult right now to imagine a future outside of these catastrophes. What does the kind of future you want to live in look like? And what do we need to do now to make that possible? Robyn?
Yes, no, I'm happy to answer that. I think that something that's so important to remember, particularly in the context of what you described as these intersecting catastrophes, and I think is something that, again, that Dion Brand's really beautiful essay recently in Toronto Star, I believe is called On the Calculus of Living and Dying, this reminder that as we move into the kind of futures that could be livable, the kind of reciprocity that we know that we need to make human survival possible, particularly for those of us who have had the least access to even being considered human, let alone been considered in the rubrics of survivability, is a break with the violences of the past as well as the present. That it's not only a matter of returning to the comforts that some people had access to in this moment, perhaps before the crisis became more visibly apparent, and this part of the world, right? Again, remembering that the crisis has been extremely apparent for Indigenous people in this part of the world for hundreds of years, for peoples globally exposed to the fault lines of the climate crisis well before. But this idea, I think, that Roy really asked us of jumping through the portal, of taking this moment to step through the portal into a different world is something that we really need to take quite seriously. And I think that we need to remember that that also demands of all of us a certain kind of sacrifice of even the uneasy comforts of what had come before this, of remembering that almost anything that rendered us comfortable in this global economy from a Canadian perspective is based on also the world endings elsewhere, looking at what it would be to imagine, a comfortable retirement here in Canada when our RRSPs are literally tied up in mining practices that are destroying the lands and livable life for people, for Black and Indigenous and racialized people all around the world. That Canadian investments are very much also in selling arms to the government of Saudi Arabia, for example, right? So that there's a certain kind of comfort that of what it means to be to have equality, even in a Canadian sense, that's based on violence, and really breaking up with that violence, realizing that not only is safety over, but for some of us, it had never arrived, right? So I think that what that allows us to do is to look around us, though, not only into this idea of the portal as being something outside of the present, but looking at to all of the beautiful actions, of course, that are taking place now that are building that world as we speak. For example, there have been a historic amount of hunger strikes, as I'd mentioned earlier, of people working not only to free themselves from the congregate settings of jails and prison and immigration detention center, but pushing for an end to our society's reliance on captivity. That there are actions happening around the country. There's one organized for on Monday in Hamilton, working, pushing, for example, in Hamilton to house everybody in encampments, to use police funding and to divert police funding directly into free housing for all, right? That these are kind of world buildings that stand to end the logics of racial and gendered and colonial violence that have structured this country for so long. That what's happening at 1492 Land Back Lane, this idea of land back, of returning land is a very clear and not theoretical articulation of what it means to build this world differently, right? That we're always on the forefront of that. And it's really just the political choices of those in power that are continually pushing aside any possibility for us to get there. So I think it's just really about that matter of thinking about the kind of supposed safety that structured the world before this one as not only over, but having never been there, and imagining security in a way that does not rely on policing, on cages, on extraction, on ongoing land theft, and thinking about the vast expansiveness that actually allows us to see happening now and as entirely possible and present in this moment.
Shama?
Yeah, thanks. So when we think about a liberatory future for all, the first thing we need to do is interrogate what we mean by liberation, or this term freedom, and how it's weaponized. So we see this invocation of freedom articulated today by the kind of individualist, antisocial, anti-maskers, and I'm just going to call them economy lovers, who exercise the freedom to give people COVID. But the freedoms of our current global regime of racial capitalism are always exclusionary. The freedom of the colonial frontier is predicated on genocide, plunder, and enslavement. The freedom of whiteness is predicated on the unfreedom of Black, Indigenous, and Brown people. The freedom of the capitalist is predicated on the unfreedom of the worker. So here I'm drawing from Marx Weiss idea Hartman. So we need to redefine freedom beyond a framework of inclusion, like what are we being included into, in order to build a future for all, which includes the abolition of whiteness along with capitalism. And there are ways that I think about these solidarities that are helpful from theorists like Denise Ferreira da Silva, who uses the phrase difference without separability. So I've been talking a bit about how the way to solidarity is to be really attuned to difference. And I would also just, if I may use Leanne's term as well, constellations of co-resistance, because I think that that's a really helpful way of thinking about this as well. So we are in a global struggle against multiple colonialisms and colonial racial capitalism, and have to build solidarity as colonized people with very different relationships to colonialism and different relationships to land. For some of us who are here, there's no place to go back to. My relative safety from anti-Muslim fascism is made possible by settler colonialism. So I have a responsibility to live in good relation here. And as fascism rises globally, attuning to historical parallels and differences between the state constructions of statehood, say in India and the settler colonial states of North America, can help us into solidarity and building futures. That is to say, what's happening in India, Brazil, Russia, Hungary, Philippines, the US, all over, these are connected, and internationalism is essential. But it starts where we are. So that's why it's crucial for Brown people to support, for example, land back, prison and police abolition, water protectors. We have to aim high together, even if it doesn't immediately seem like it is our struggle. And somebody else who's helpful for me to think through this is Robyn Kimmerer, who talks about how the garlic mustard is this invasive species who poisons the soil, but the plantain, while being an immigrant plant, actually makes itself helpful and kind of nourishes flourishing and becomes naturalized to the place. So Kimmerer writes, to become naturalized is to know that your ancestors lie in this ground. Here you will give your gifts and meet your responsibility. To become naturalized is to live as if your children's futures matter, to take care of the land as if our lives and all our relatives depend on it, because they do. So she's talking here about how, inviting immigrants to become, naturalized here might sound like inviting the plunderers to, break into your house and stay for dinner. But reframing it with using this, metaphor, not even metaphor, like really materiality of the garlic, mustard, and plantain. And I think this doubling of gift and responsibility is a useful frame, because it accounts for the responsibilities of Brown people to fight against anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. And it also asks us to consider what possible gifts, can being Brown and all of its variations bring to Turtle Island, and what ways can we make ourselves useful to foster flourishing like the plantain.
My vision is to create Anishinaabe futures and presents that structurally refuse and reject the processes and practices that end Indigenous life, Black life, Brown life, and the resulting environmental desecration in Canada and beyond. And so this requires building societies, Black, Brown, Indigenous societies that function without police and prisons. For me, this is an Anishinaabe formation that is aligned with radical Black freedom struggles. My world building must support the world building of Black freedom struggles. My radical imaginings must not replicate anti-Blackness, but bring forth what in my culture is Minnow Bamadzawin, but bring forth more life, not just Anishinaabe life, not just human life, but more life.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been, for me, a deeply moving conversation. And again, just so grateful for your generosity in being here and in opening up yourself to me and to the audience, to our audience. We have 25 minutes and a few questions. I'm going to start by directing a few of them to specific participants. If it's a question you don't feel totally comfortable answering, it's fine to say that. So I'm going to start with a question from Tashi. She says, how would Leanne Simpson interpret Congresswoman Deb Haaland's choice to remove clauses requiring protections for freedmen in line with treaty requirements? Is that a question you're comfortable answering, Leanne?
A little bit. This is a context that is different. It's from a different nation, and it's from a different country. Mm-hmm. But I will say, from my own Anishinaabe perspective, I think the ethical practices that I have inherited from my ancestors do mean that I have to struggle and interrogate anti-Blackness, and that it is not okay for me to replicate anti-Blackness in any form. And I don't see anything about our political traditions and our treaty-making traditions outside of what the state imposes on us, outside of the nation state and racial capitalism and enclosures and ownership, that conflict with that. I think that I have an ethical responsibility to work with those Black mobilizations and radical imaginings.
Thank you. There's a question from Dwayne Plaza that's directed to Shama. So Shama, there's a long history of anti-Black sentiment by Asians in the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana in particular. Over time, the same anti-Asian sentiment runs parallel. In Canada, South Asians arrive and bring or adapt an anti-Black sentiment, often assuming these values, but also bringing them with them. What are some strategies or ideas for really bringing together these groups in Canada? So if I might just add, for some Black people and Black communities in the Caribbean, the antagonism is not Black and white, it's actually Black and what, Canadians call brown.
Yeah, so I can't speak too much to the Caribbean situation, but if I may speak to being here, and I really do think that I would be remiss in this talk if I didn't bring up how the myth of the model minority weaponizes Brown people for anti-Blackness and anti-Indigeneity. And so, you might have heard the term model minority. It's the difference between, the good brown people and others such as Black and Indigenous people. And a lot of the ways that this functions is the brown people thinking, oh, we came with $2 in our pockets. Look at how we've made it. But they're, the people who buy into this model miss that the subjugation of brown people is not foundational to North America, and it is anti-Black. White supremacy needs some brown people to succeed in order to legitimize itself as not white supremacist. And the other thing that happens with this is that it erases the condition that South Asian people are, also in North America, one of the biggest groups of undocumented people living in poverty, subject to deportation. So, COVID is the worst in Brampton because many of these brown people, there are also other racialized people, they're essential workers. But the model minority myth, so it's not just a weapon against Black and Indigenous people directly, but also indirectly, because if the discourse around brownness is aspirational, it can be an obstacle to solidarities with other racialized people. And so of course there's this long history, and I mentioned in my opening the ways that specific policies were put in to keep African and Indian people separate. But one thing, so moving into like what gives me hope or how to dismantle this, I've been seeing the ways that social media is allowing people to form these connections across social justice movements. And second generation brown people have historically at least tried to assimilate in settler culture. So you get, Oreo and coconut taunts, but they were also sometimes a badge of honor, like I'm the whitest brown person. But what I'm seeing more with young people is a rejection of that easy assimilation. And so I just want to give an example of how building a future with Black and Indigenous people means brown people have to make some sacrifices. So this summer during the protests for George Floyd in Minneapolis, an Indian restaurant, Gandhi Mahal, was burned down. And they could have easily bought into the violence and looting narrative of the police and government and would have been sympathetic non-white victims for whiteness to weaponize against Black people. But instead they went on social media and wrote, "Let my building burn, justice needs to be served. Gandhi Mahal may have felt the flames last night, but our fiery drive to help protect and stand with our community will never die." So for me, this is just the beginning of what we can do if we do things together. And it also requires brown people disinvesting themselves from proximity to whiteness and success within capitalism.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There's a question from Angel, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Aluk, that I'm going to ask Robyn to reflect on, although it wasn't directly pointed at you. But it's a question about those of us who occupy space in academia, whether we're teachers or graduate students, and or undergraduate students, how understanding that clearly the theoretical questions we take up are important, but how do we kind of translate those ideas and thoughts into tangible action, I guess, and into action that can help us build allyship. So I think that you have tried to answer some of this, but maybe just briefly, again, how to do this work. Is it through participating in social movements like BLM, MMIW, and or through social policy changes and the criminal justice system through corporate social responsibility partnerships? If people are kind of looking for a way to practically help, how do we translate? How do we move outside of the university classroom to do some of this work?
Thank you so much for reading that question. I'll answer it in a few different parts. One part is that I think that, although there are some parts of academia that can be inaccessible, that are not always, it's not that academia is necessarily in conversation with social movement or is necessarily radical. But to me, where some of the most beautiful work has come from, particularly when it comes to Black and Indigenous radical work that is now, become canonical in universities, I think it's important to remember that a lot of those works were not necessarily created in a way that was intended to be divided from the people, that they're speaking about, right? So if we look, for example, to what I would say is really the canon of understanding like the carceral state at this time, like George Jackson's Blood in My Eye, Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton's Black Power, you know, understanding that these texts are not, I guess they're not always considered the canon, but there are so many really important texts that have made something like Black studies conceivable and possible, that were created to transcend any kind of difference, that were created to change the world, right? That were about directly reaching and being in touch with peoples. I think there can sometimes be sort of this imagined separation that can sometimes assume, I suppose, that people who are working, people who are not in academic jobs aren't able to understand concepts like capitalism, like anti-Black racism, when in fact just the opposite is true, where we see some of the most substantive shifts in our times and radical movements in our times have occurred on a grassroots level, are happening, for example, you know, in the streets, in community centers, with some academics helping, but that's never really been the primary site of transformation, even if there's always been sort of some radical edges of academia that have worked alongside the creation of that, you know, of really working towards a transformed society, I suppose. As to that other question of becoming involved, I think that especially now, we're in a time where Marianne Cabas speaks about this a lot, and I find it really helpful that there are so many freedom-oriented actions that are happening, particularly coming out of this summer of Black-led and multiracial revolt. Like if we're looking across the country, we can see moves in almost every Canadian city to remove police from schools. We're seeing a strong drive to bring people home from prisons, from jails, to stop the prevention of new jails in Ottawa, in smaller towns in Ontario, and Halifax. That this is really a time when I think there's never been more ways to become involved in racial justice struggles, whether that's in your capacity as a teacher, whether that's in your capacity as a student. You know, there are moves to, for example, move to get police off campus, whether that's, I just really think, you know, there's this new organization, Doctors for Defunding, that has come out, which is medical practitioners in support of understanding health in a way that, again, shows us that policing and prisons is actually a threat to health and to public health, right? So I just think that there's no constraint on the place in which you can take your own work in the service of the really important liberatory work that is happening right now at this time. It's almost a matter of too much rather than not enough. And I think that's always been true, but I've never seen more movement, particularly work against the carceral state, particularly work against policing in prison and jails in Canada, as I have right now. So I think it's a really vibrant time for people of any racial background to really become involved in supporting the impetus of the struggle, which of course we call of the spring and summer in the wake of George Floyd, but we know that this is part of the broader Black Lives Matter movement that has been happening for years before, which is of course in conversation with generations and generations of struggle going backwards, right? So, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go to what is, there's so many questions coming all the time. I'm not sure I can keep up with all of them. But there's a question that's a bit provocative coming from Hira Singh. Do we have to abolish everything capitalism? Sorry, let me make that live. Do we have to demolish, everything capitalism, colonialism has built? And the questioner's own take is no, whatever is built in capitalism, colonialism is a property of the laboring classes. The resources for what is built came from the colonized world. And yes, the colonized world, but all this has been appropriated by a small minority. So all we have to abolish or demolish is a small minority that has appropriated it and use what has been built for the good of all people. Is that a possibility? Robyn?
I'm happy to take a stab at that one. I think that it's a difficult question to answer, because I think that if you answer the question one way, do we have to demolish capitalism, colonialism, period, The answer is absolutely yes, right? If we're looking at an economic and political system, a geopolitical structuring of the world that's premised on labor exploitation, expropriation, land dispossession, there's no way to live in anything that we could call humane with a society that is actually requires dispossession, requires exploitation, requires that some people be proximate to death, and so that others can gain profit, right? There's no, and this always being articulated along racial lines, this always being articulated along gender hierarchies. There's no way for that system to become humane, because it's premised on value as something that's totally divorced from what, different ways we could assign meaning to human life, to life on this planet, to life on this earth. If it's only an accumulation logic is something that is, we can see very clearly, unstoppably propelling the earth into catastrophe. And of course, a catastrophe again on grossly racially uneven lines. But if we want to talk about the end of an economic system, though, I don't think there's any necessary way that we need to connect that to the ending of institutions, period, right? Like, I think that what we're seeing right now is, of course, a push for the abolition of prisons, of policing. But that's, if we think with, with Ruth Wilson Gilmore's, with organizers who've been on the front of this kind of movement for a long time, it's never been solely about sort of tearing down buildings, so much as it is about creating the conditions where we do not require policing, creating the conditions where we do not require cages to hold people in. So of course it's ending those institutions, but it's not a wholly destructive project, in that it is one that really is about creation and transformation, right? As opposed to something that's just viewed as sort of like a wholesale destruction. But does that require a radical departure from the status quo of the present? I think absolutely. And I think it's only imagined as destructive if we don't look at how destructive this economic system actually is, right? If we're willing to tolerate the kind of vulnerability to death, to harm, that is actually part of and required of the system that we require now. So I think that if we understand really the brutalities that are embedded into the world that we live in today, it becomes less dramatic to imagine the need for a radical transformation. But I do think that it really is about building meaningful alternatives, right? If we even think about what it means, it's not the end of having access to things like food and medicine, right? But it's about having access to those things in a way that doesn't mean that some people have no food and no medicine, right? So I think that's a helpful way for me to think about the answer to that question.
Yes, you absolutely have to demolish capitalism and colonialism and white supremacy and anti-Blackness, and there is no way around that. If you tinker with those systems, if you redistribute the resources, that might be a great first step. If you offer reparations, if you redistribute equally, equitably, these resources and the prizes of capitalism and colonialism. But that might be a good first step. That might work for a few weeks, but these systems are complex and they are evil, and they will reproduce themselves, and they will reproduce a world that will continue that oppression, that will continue that violence, that will continue that conquest. So I don't see any way of tinkering with those systems. I only see world building coming through the destruction of those death machines and life-ending forces. So I agree with you, Robyn.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes. Let me see. There was a question here about hatred by Floyd Harriet. So hatred has been often seen as a closely associated element with racism. If for no other reason, hate speech and violent acts galvanize and polarize people like nothing else, and with no surprise leads to higher viewing ratings. Is hatred an essential cause of racism, or is it a byproduct, perhaps from the frustration that is built up when people feel cornered, constrained, and confused? If this is a cause, what can the everyday person do? And I don't know if the everyday person here is white, but what can the everyday person do?
I will just say one of the ways that we talk about hatred is about the feelings in somebody's heart, and we need to think about it as a structure. And we can use this term from cultural studies, Raymond Williams structure of feeling, because once we start talking about these people hate these people, we can see the solution being located in I don't know, training programs for racist senators. That then it becomes like they just need to learn this, or no, we just need police officers to not have hate in their heart, that the reason that police officers are violent to Black and Indigenous people is because they quote unquote hate them, when you see all kinds of otherwise racialized people, even Black police officers who are doing this. It's a structural issue, right? And so that's why I think that it's very tricky to talk about hatred, because also if we take that out of it, then we're missing this whole affective structure that has to do with racism. It's about power, it's also about affect. And this is, where I'm really indebted to theorists like Saidiya Hartman for thinking about, the entanglement of affect and power. So we need to hold both of those things, the sort of resistance to using hate as individualizing, but I think not throwing out this idea that there is some kind of emotional aspect to the exercising of this power.
I mean, I would add to that only briefly, which is that I think that, yeah, it can be helpful, to echo Shama, to isolate hatred as the most dangerous or the most horrific, as the place where racism lives, or the kind of racism that exists. So for example, I've lived most of my adult life in Quebec, where I would say racism is more outwardly expressed, and that's more tolerable than it is in a city like Toronto, where, for example, you have the mayor giving people in Black Lives Matter a medal, where you have, where you have political officials who will say words like anti-Black racism unprompted, and yet you continue to still see Black people being murdered by the police at astronomical rates, actually at the highest rates in the country, right? In a place where we don't see the same kind of cultural tolerance for a certain kind of vitriolic, outwardly expressed racism. And in fact, I think that a very Canadian kind of racism, although of course we see exceptions to this if we look at the recent settler violence in the East Coast, of course, if we look to what happens in the prairies, but I think there's a particular kind of polite Canadian racism that differentiates itself from somewhere like the United States, because here, to some extent, that sort of very outwardly expressed hatred is not seen as tolerable. And what that allows for is disguising a multitude of horrific violences, whether that's, in a post-reconciliation world, the ongoing, policing, very violent policing of land struggles, of the building of a pipeline by our reconciliation prime minister, right? Or whether you have Justin Trudeau taking a knee and then moving forward with policies that would, again, something like body cameras, that we're going directly against what Black activists have been asking for in terms of actually a reduction of policing, the defunding of policing in this country. So this very polite shift away from hatred is actually one way often where Canadian society actually disguises a kind of structural relationship that is nonetheless murderous, that we need to understand as murderous, despite what might be expressed, despite what we might be reading in the face, despite the words that might be coming out of the mouth, for example.
Thank you. I'm going to end with one last question from Miguel Gonzalez. What are your views regarding bringing in, reaching out to allies, is the word he uses, how to build alliances with the broader non-Indigenous Black society? So I guess just in parting words, what would you say to those people seeking to do this work as allies or co-resistors?
I will just say very, very briefly that my problem with the term ally is that it makes it seem as if we are adjacent to the struggle instead of embedded in it, whether it is like our complicity within it or kind of connected sort of colonial oppression. And so I spoke a little bit about having to give some things up, giving up proximity to whiteness and success under capitalism.
I mean, I think I would just add very briefly that people need to see their own liberation as tied up in the liberation of Indigenous peoples, of Black peoples. It's one thing, of course, to express a kind of sympathetic outrage, but it's really important to understand that the conditions under which we're living are inhuman for all, even if you may be positioned slightly further from the drain, right? So I think that what Christina Sharp asks of us, and lose your kin, right? Lose this attack, lose the drive to be part of the of whiteness, which in any ways is only a psychological protection, is a protection that, with limitations, is a protection that will never truly protect your grandchildren, particularly in the context of this world that we're living in today. So I think that really the time is yesterday. I don't see it as something that I see as my job to bring people in, but I think it's people's job to take responsibility for the world that your ancestors, that you are a part of, and to understand the future as something that we would like to be habitable, not only for those who manage to sort of escape on Trump's or Elon Musk's space pod after this planet is done, right? But to actually take very seriously the threats of our time, finally, after a 500-year trajectory of refusing life, to choose life instead.
Thank you. That's very powerful. Leanne?
I think that in terms of solidarity, the only thing that I would add is that I think that the effort and the energy in relationship building, I think the most potentiality is between Indigenous, Black and Brown, racialized, anti-colonial peoples in Canada and beyond, rather than having this focus on the white allyship. I think that that's a far more generative practice, mutually supporting each other's resistances, showing up, doing the material support and the labor, rather than begging white people to listen and have a heart.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's 4:01. It's been a long 2 hours, but so needful. Thank you so much, Shama, Leanne, Robyn, for sharing this afternoon with me and with us, for accepting my invitation to come. My immense gratitude to you for sharing your heart and work and challenging us to engage carefully and ethically with questions about our own power and positionality, encouraging us to live in mutual care with generosity and humility, to foster a kind of radical hospitality, to choose life, as Robyn says, instead of death, and to be willing to learn and grow together. So as I close, again, thank you to all the participants. As my people say in Jamaica, walk good, be strong and bold and brave, as our panelists have encouraged us to do, to think against the grain and to be honest with ourselves and with each other. Walk good, be well, take care.